All righty. That should be firing up. And if you're thinking that the chancel looks a little bit different today, we have a wedding on Saturday. And so trying to figure out the logistics of doing a wedding in our sanctuary is a is an interesting thing. So for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, good afternoon. Um, Slightly was only a minute delayed, but I'm glad that you were joining us. Delayed because really it is an interesting question, isn't it? You know, that in the early church, every time they got big enough, they had to splinter off into smaller groups because so much of what we think about when we think about our worshiping communities, our faith communities, is how engaged are we, right? Um, I think a lot of people, you know, that engagement isn't as important, but clearly the early church knew that engagement was everything, right? Being involved, being a part of the ministries, doing the work, um, stepping into what needed to be done on a regular daily basis. And sometimes, you know, I think some organizations can get too big and they lose sight of that. I think some of the, I would, I would, I would wonder if some of the big mega churches, their ministry is their number, you know? Yeah. 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 Well, and I would guess that in the biggest ones, yeah, it has to be, you know, because the people who give the most have always expected that their money buys them access. I mean, I think we see that in politics today, you know, is that the people who have the most money, they figured that, well, if I write you a big enough check, then you got to do what I want, or I should be able to, you know, tell you everything that I'm thinking about, and you should do something about it. And so, and in the church, that's always been the balancing act because you need to know what people are giving so that you know what the budget looks like so you can do the ministry, but you don't want to be influenced by that and say, well, you know, those top five givers, they get more of my time. Well, try really hard, you know, and that's a really important thing. And what's fascinating is that the early church had that same problem. Right? We see that throughout Paul's letters. We see that in the book of Acts. They're always talking about, you know, essentially telling the rich people, you folks have got to settle down, right? This is not all about you. We're grateful that you are giving, that you're giving generously, that you can do that. That's awesome because it means that we can do more, right? We can do the ministry to which we have been called. And so we need you to be able to give like that because, you know, if I tithe, it's different than somebody who, you know, is a one percenter and they tithe. I mean, if one of these billionaires wanted to, you know, tithe to Genesis Lutheran Church, our budget problems, which, you know, we don't have as significant as some other congregations, but every congregation's got some budget issues. If they want to drop $1 million into my plate someday, I'm not going to say no, but I'm also not going to say that gets you special privileges, you know, it's thank you. That's awesome. Please, by all means, if you feel like doing that again, because then we can expand our ministry. Then we can do even more of what we're already doing. And it's fascinating because jumping back into the last chapter of the letter to the Hebrews, the preacher is going to be like, okay, I've been telling you this the whole time. And what I want you to really grasp, what I really want you to understand is, what are the ministries to which we have been called, right? And that's one of those things that this last chapter, 13, if you haven't had a chance to read it, do read it this week, because it feels like it's a different part or from a different author almost. It's so different than the rest of the letter to the Hebrews. And I was reading through, and scholar Tom Long really nailed it when he said, if the whole first 12 chapters is a sermon that the preacher is preaching, chapter 13 is the announcements and the benediction at the end of the service. Essentially, it's like, and this is an interesting thing, because the themes and the language, it's all the same, but it just feels like it's a different style of writing, and that's because it is. It's not a different author. Some people have suggested that maybe chapter 13 was from a different author, and it really isn't, because all of the same themes are there. But it feels like kind of an epilogue or an addendum. And so I think about it in terms of the fact that oftentimes when we would do announcements here at Genesis, we would do them a while ago. We did them first, right? And I did them first because I'm waiting for everybody to come in. Genesis, like so many congregations, not everybody's there right at 10 o'clock. And so you always want to kind of ease into the service, let people, actually get out of the parking lot and things like that. And so we would do announcements first. And when I would do the announcements, I'm already thinking about everything that's going on in the service and the texts and everything like that. And so you shape the announcements through the lens, or you see it through the lens of the text that I'm going to preach on, that we're going to hear in worship, the time of the church year that it is, all this kind of stuff. And I remember one time, more than once, my daughter would say to me that she often joked that the announcements was just another opportunity for me to preach a second sermon. It's like, Dad, you're preaching before you're preaching, And she's not wrong, because they're hitting the same things. So if you do the announcements at the end of the service, like we're doing now, it's still the same thing, because now you're like, oh, wait a minute, I want to reinforce this theme that I had talked about during the sermon, but through the lens of the ministries that we are, that are coming up this week. And so the scholar Tom Long says, these are the preacher's announcements at the end of service. And so what he's going to do is he's going to hit a couple major things that they're clearly working on, but he wants everybody to see these things through the lens of everything that he's been talking about. I really love the way that works. And then at the end of it, of course, is a benediction. And at the end of it, there's a little postscript that is just, kind of is one more thing, right? And so I want to go through chapter 13's announcements for all intents and purposes, because these are some of the passages that when we hear them, we're like, wait a minute, I know that verse. They're really well known. They're short, they're punchy. He's just going through a list. I mean, think of this as he's got a list of ministries that he wants to remind everybody about, but he wants to frame those ministries in this bigger discussion he has about who Jesus is and whose we are, and that Jesus is the high priest who calls us into this work. And so just kind of moving through them is a really fascinating exercise. And the first is he's going to talk about hospitality. And I don't know of a preacher that doesn't at some point talk about hospitality. And this is what the preacher says in Hebrews. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, so some have entertained angels without knowing it, right? Every week, there's the constant, ebb and flow of the discussion of, oh, look, we have new people in, right? How do you show them hospitality? How do you care for them even though you haven't met them before, right? And I want you to think what it must have been like in the first century when this congregation is growing, right? The congregation of the letter to the Hebrews. They're growing, they're shrinking, they're growing, they're shrinking. New people are in, old people go, move off, or things like, and so it's constantly churning. And in that time, it would have been really easy to say, we know who we know, and yeah, you want to join the church, but we're deeply suspicious of why you're here. This is a time of persecution. This is a time when they had to be careful about people they didn't know, right? And so you have to find that fine line between being careful about new people and welcoming new people in, right? We're going through that again in the churches because of the attack of the church in Grand Blanc, right? Anytime there's a shooting or some kind of act of violence in a congregation in the United States, everybody gets really focused on we have to protect ourselves, right? And there's a whole spectrum of the way in which you're going to do that. I heard one person say, as soon as everybody's in, lock the doors. That way nobody else can get in. He said, what about if somebody's running late? Well, they can knock. But you know what? How welcoming is that, right? If somebody comes to the door who has never been here before, right? Then the ushers have got to decide whether they're going to let them in or not. And so the question is always, what is your ministry of hospitality? How welcoming are you? In an environment in which being wholly open and welcoming feels a little naive. And that's what they were dealing with. Exactly what they were dealing with. I don't have a lot of good answers on that one. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Genesis is actually pretty ideally situated in the fact that we really only have one entrance. We do have other entrances, but we don't use them, right? So on Sunday morning, everybody comes in through this front door, and we always have people who are right there. Well, the ushers, right? They're the first line of our ministry of hospitality. As people are coming in, will they feel welcomed or not? And do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, that some have entertained angels without knowing it. We don't know who to expect, what to expect. But the role, right, is to show hospitality, to show grace, to err on the side of that. And in times of suspicion, that's hard, right? It's just difficult. The other Pastor Grant and I were talking about this simply because one of her congregations has more entrances than you can shake a stick at. I mean, it's just, there's so many different places to get into one of her buildings that you couldn't staff all of them, right? I mean, if you did, you'd have half the congregation sitting at different doors. There's just so many of them. And so you have to kind of say, all right, we're going to funnel people in this place. But how do you do that in such a way that safeguards everybody and shows hospitality at the same time? And so the preacher here is saying, yeah, you got to do that. That's that ministry of hospitality. And notice it's his first announcement, which means it's really important, right? This is the thing that makes the most difference. And so we have to think about all of our grand theology, all of our deep explorations of scripture and all this other kind of stuff. It hits the road when we see somebody new, right? That's when the rubber meets the road, and we have to make a decision of how we're going to live out what it means to have a ministry of hospitality, because we don't know. And so I guess I'd rather err on the side of grace, a welcome, of openness. That may be a fatal flaw, but if that's the mistake I'm going to make, I'd rather make this mistake than essentially saying, stay out. That's just me. But it's something that every congregation has to wrestle with. And reading Hebrews is helpful because they've lived through this. And we know this because the very next announcement in the chapter 13 of the letter to the Hebrews is, remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. And so immediately steps into and then talks about the fact that, when they're in prison, they're going to be abused, right? That's the way that works. The reason that the preacher mentions prison second is that this is a time when Christians are going to get nabbed, right? For being Christian. It's not legal. And the Roman authorities aren't exactly thrilled with it because it seems to be riling up the lower classes, right? The poor, the enslaved, the people just barely scraping by because the Roman Empire, like any kind of system that is hierarchical, is everything funnels to the top. It doesn't all come down to the bottom. Right? Everything is just bled up in through the system. And so Christianity, especially because Jesus is always talking about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and taking care of, the people who are in need and lifting up the oppressed, this makes autocratic governments really nervous, right? It's why I think right now, strangely enough, the Pope is really making some of our elected officials really nervous because he keeps talking about, well, one of the things that you're supposed to do is take care of immigrants, not arrest them and make them disappear. That's hardly welcoming the stranger. If you're going to come right out and say, I'm a Christian, well, then guess what? You know what side you are on the idea of immigration. You just do, right? And that's hard. That's really hard. And so there are people back then that they were members of their congregation who would have been in prison because of the faith. Don't forget them, right? And go visit them, right? Go physically. Don't just offer thoughts and prayers, right? This is, you got to embody the faith. If faith is just a thing you have, then that's great, but it's not the whole story. It's also the life you live. And so the preacher is saying, get out there and remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. It's visit those who are in need. Take care of those who are sick. Interestingly enough, one of our folks who's been visiting with us regularly over the week, one of the people who has been coming to church with them couldn't make it, and they said, can I take communion home to them? Like, absolutely you can. Absolutely. Because interestingly enough, that's one of the earliest jobs that the deacons did for the church. If the presbyter or priest, right, the pastor essentially, as they gave communion to everybody who came to worship that Sunday, if somebody wasn't there because they were sick or they just couldn't make it, but they really the deacons would take it to them, right? It's the extension of the table out into the rest of the world. Everything that we do here extends out into the world. We come, we get fed so that we can go feed. We come and are strengthened so that we can go strengthen. We come and learn so that we can go teach, right? Everything flows from worship. and then shoots right out the doors with each one of us. And so the preacher is just marking off things. Don't forget this, don't forget this. And notice all of it is, it's a concrete ministry thing based on all the stuff that he had been talking about who we are and whose we are, right? And then he's going to hit a few more, right? Because he's got a whole list, and I love the list. The next he's going to talk about both marriage and money. And you're like, oh, you knew this was going to turn south at some point, because if there are two subjects that people don't want to hear from the pulpit, it's marriage and money. Well, mostly because the marriage thing is because the church has done a really bad job of it, right? It's like we've got a wedding coming up this weekend, and it always reminds me of, and this is just one of those things. I've been to a lot of marriages or a lot of weddings in Roman Catholic congregations, and I always laugh when it comes to the homily or the sermon, and the priest stands up there and starts talking about what makes a good marriage. And all I can think of is like, fella, you have no idea. Are you married? Unmarried marriage counselors, right? And an unmarried priest telling folks how to live their life as a good married couple. It always seems one of those things that it's like, maybe talk about something else, just about anything else, because it doesn't fit. In this particular case, if the preacher is who we think it could be, right? It's either Priscilla or it's Priscilla and her husband Aquila. They're on safe ground. They're a good, stable, married couple who's been in ministry. They're doing their thing. And so if this is them, then great. And what they're essentially saying is the preacher's really on solid ground here, or really well, at least well-known ground. Steer clear of fornication and adultery. Essentially, and this is a great thing, don't love the wrong person, right? You made vows, all right? Nobody forced you to do that. You made those vows. You made those vows in front of the congregation, and you made those vows in front of God. All right? So if you made those vows, live up to them. If you can't, okay. They have writs of divorce back then. That happens. It's okay, right? Just do it the right way. Follow through. And then the other part is don't love the wrong things, i.e. greed, right? And what's really interesting, though, is that the preacher is going to focus both of these things on the broader conversation about Christology. And remember, Christology, big word for, essentially the person and work of Christ. Essentially, who is Jesus? What does Jesus do? Right? That's when we're talking about Christology, that's what we're talking about. And that's a really important thing, because the preacher is essentially saying that fornication and adultery are not mere moral lapses, right? This is the framework that the preacher is building. It's not a mere moral lapse, it's essentially a denial of the sanctifying work of Jesus. And what does sanctification mean? It means that we're supposed to move past those kinds of things. If we made a vow, sanctification is being made more holy through the work of the Spirit and by Jesus, and we're supposed to get better at things. And so if we take a vow, regardless of what that vow is, it's if in our life in Christ we're supposed to get better at things, then we're going to keep that vow. That's all. It's not a moral failing, right? It's not some ghastly thing. It's just like maybe you haven't grown as much as you thought you grew. And that's what he's really saying. It's like, you're supposed to get better at these things. You're supposed to grow as a Christian. You're supposed to, in the understanding of Christ became like us so that we would become more like him, right? And one of the things that's absolutely central is, frankly, anytime they start talking about fornication and adultery and all that kind of stuff, I just really want to point people back to the fact that What Jesus is calling us to be is faithful. Faithful to the people that we make vows to, right? And if there comes a time when you say to yourself, you know what? This person that I am married to, I can no longer be faithful to for perfectly legitimate reasons. Okay, then you say, we're going to take the adult way out of this and say, we're going to divorce, right? I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, you know what? This relationship didn't work as we thought it was going to. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that, right? People have been, as long as there's been marriage, there's been divorce. That's just the way it is. Because human beings, and I hate to say this, are human beings. You know, sometimes we enter in and we're going, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be perfect, right? And then you're like, you know what? That didn't work out. Okay, that's fine. You know,
Once you hear that statement, he says it's a Bible. We gotta go read through everything you said about where just to get to that conclusion of where does the state at? Where humans are flawed, so everything we do is gonna have a flaw in it.
it only works, right? Because the first, people always use Genesis, was it Genesis chapter 2? What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Okay. But if that was in Genesis 2, that was still in Eden when we were supposed to be perfect. And then God found out that we weren't, right? That we're flawed, that we make mistakes, that even Adam and Eve, right, couldn't do it, weren't perfect. And so I think there's a recognition, at least I had this recognition, and I think most clergy who are honest had this recognition, is that some human relationships just ain't going to work. You know, that's okay. You know, and so that's why you have a way to not do that or a way to get out of that, right? Because if we were perfect, we wouldn't need divorce. But we're perfect. We're not perfect. And so guess what? You know, we're human beings. And now, because if one human being can make a mess of things, can you imagine what two human beings, right? And so the church gets hung up on that because, and this is where it's problematic, because a lot of our conversation about marriage and divorce comes from Paul. And Paul wasn't married, right? Some of the other disciples were. I'd rather listen to Peter talk about, right? Because he was married. We know that because Jesus talks about healing his mother-in-law, right? Paul wasn't married, which makes his opinions on marriage, you know, not suspect, but got to take that with a pinch of salt, you know. But I think we can get hung up on that. And the question always has been for me, why? Why is that? Why do people get so strung up on that or hung up on that alone? Because that's the thing. I mean, you know, the church, the Roman Catholic Church still won't, you know, allow divorced people to take communion. Yeah, it makes no sense to me. But they see marriage as a sacrament and we don't. And I think that's one of the major differences. But I think you can get really stuck on the issue. Some people are going to stay married forever, and some people aren't. And I think, you know, was it 50% of marriages in the United States end in divorce? Okay, well, that's 50-50. Okay, you know, it is what it is. But let's not use the Bible to, you know, beat people with on the issue, because it's all about human beings. And then, of course, this is the worst part of it. As a historian, marriage is not what happens in Genesis 2. Yeah, I mean, they're joined together by God, but that's not a marriage. It's not. It's not what it's called. Um, Interestingly enough, this is when my students would always realize that I was a real romantic because we would talk about marriage. And if you look historically speaking, marriage is just a contract. It's a legal contract. The the church blesses weddings, but the state makes them real. It's a legal contract. So on Saturday, when the young couple gets married, at one point in the service, they're going to go over to the credence table and they're going to sign their wedding license, right? They could do that down in the Justice of the Peace because it's a legal document. Now, if you stand in front of the congregation and God have your marriage blessed, right? That's a different conversation, right? But be really clear, marriage is a function of the state. A relationship, that's in God's purview, right? We can get so wrapped around that axle. It's not even, because as far as I'm concerned, it's just one of those things where it's like, you know what? Be good to each other in whatever relationship that you have. If it's going to be this thing we call a marriage, then be good to each other. And if there's a point in time when you can't be, okay, then I'd rather you amicably split than make each other miserable. And as far as the author of Hebrews is talking about, that's not really the issue. It's not a moral failing. This isn't about that. It's just well, you took a vow. You said you were going to get better because of life in Christ. And if you can't do that, okay, got it. Move on. And then still grow, right? Don't let this be the thing that trips you up. And it's really about faithfulness, fundamentally, and being good to each other. And frankly, being good to each other should be something that we should be striving to do for every relationship that we have, including our primary relationships, right? I buy my wife flowers not because I have to, but because I want to. That's it. That's all it is, right? Because I love doing that. I always love going to the grocery store and I buy flowers and, oh, somebody's in trouble. I've heard that comment so many times, even sometimes when I've got my collar on, which is a fascinating concept all by itself. It's like, no, I just do this because this is how, I like to nurture my primary relationship. Just one of those little things, just tiny little stuff. But that's because people get hung up on it and they, instead of seeing what it actually is God said that it's not good for us to be alone. All right, so that means all relationships are things that we have to work on. And the marriage relationship is just one of those things that you have to, it takes work. That's a good thing. What is it? How many years? And of course, my wife is probably watching right now, so if I get this wrong, we're married in 90. So it'll be 36 years in May, right? Denise is like, get this one right, fella. So, all right. So moving on. The other part of it is regarding money and greed, right? The preacher references Deuteronomy, I will never leave you or forsake you, and Psalm 118, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. The preacher is going to situate the problem of the love of money not so much as the product of greed as it is the fear of abandonment. And I love this exploration because essentially what the preacher is saying is like, not everybody who is collecting as much as they can is greedy, although I think that's a part of it, is because they got to have something to hold on to, they think. They're so afraid of being without that they're trying to collect something to fill the void, in which he says, well, just think of it this way, when Jesus grasps your hand in love, it frees you to open up your other clenched fist and let the money go. you have what you need. You have that relationship with God in Christ. You don't have to try to fill the emptiness in your soul because it's not empty. And so I find that just to be just a really interesting. Oh, yeah. Denise said, yes, I was right. 36 years. This is the problem when the two of us get goofing about this kind of stuff, because when we are down in Texas and I was just a university professor, and every Sunday morning I would do some of the announcements. I did a lot of the faith formation stuff, and the two of us would start bantering during announcements to the great enjoyment of the congregation, because when we're together, we're goofballs. I mean, it's just the way it is. All right. So the whole business about about money is that we grab it because we think we've got nothing else. And I want you to think about some of our billionaires running across the American scene right now, and the very wealthy people. And none of them usually seem particularly content or happy, right? They're always questing for more. They're always desperate to get more. Part and parcel of the problem that we have with our president right now is that he is so desperate to be admired or loved or respected or even feared. He's so desperate for everybody else's attention. And I think it's because he doesn't get any, right? And so he uses money and other things to try to fill a hole in his soul, that what the preacher is saying is that he would probably say that our president feels alone. Never admit it. He'll never admit it. But everything he does is to try to feel loved. And it's because he never was as a child. And so, and he can't articulate that. And he wouldn't even know what love is if you told him. Because it's all been sublimated into want, into desire, into gratification. And so it just, he doesn't know, he wouldn't know what it was like to be loved if you paid him. He just wants your money because he thinks that's going to fill the void. And what the preacher is saying is like, it's the love of Christ that fills that void, because what that void is our need to be loved, our need to be connected, our need to know that we're a part of something bigger. If you are always isolating yourself and trying to fill in that with something else, there's no substitute. It doesn't work otherwise. I think of Elon Musk, right? He's another really good example. The man is desperate for attention. He's the richest man in the world. Why does he care what any of us think? But he wants not simply to be the wealthiest person in the world. He wants everybody's respect or their admiration or their love or something. And it just means that he's got none of it. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right, that in order to receive it, you got to give it. It's a two-way street. It's a covenant, right? And that part of their brains has turned off somewhere. And so, and I think in many ways, the preacher here is really hitting on something important, right? It's that connection. You know, I was having a great conversation with a member of the congregation who said that when inviting other people to come to church, you really try to emphasize the connection that they have with other people. We crave that. We crave to, yeah, there are times when I need peace and quiet. I get it, right? But there's a reason why the greatest punishment in the American penal system is solitary confinement. It's cruel. It's unusual. It's it's dehumanizing. It's barbaric because people need people. And what the preacher is saying here is that sometimes if you keep trying to stuff money into that hole in your life, you've missed the point. And so when Jesus takes your hand, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I am connected. I do have something, right? And then if I'm connected to Jesus, that means I'm connected to this community. And if I'm connected to this community, then even though, say, maybe I am really quite poor, part of their call is to give me a helping hand. And so not only is this hand filled with God's hand, this hand is also reaching out to somebody or who has reached out to me. I think that's really important, right? I mean, it's such a little section, and it'd be so easy to kind of miss it as it goes by, or to get bogged down into the marriage part of it, or to do once a thing, it's like it's the love of money that's the problem. Well, the love of money exists because we don't have other kinds of love in our lives, right? If some of these people just had loving parents when they were little, I wonder how different they would be, right? If they were well bonded with their families, or they had good friends, not friends that would get them something, but just good friends. Some of these people, I don't know if I've ever seen them smile or tell a good-natured joke, laugh with people, right? Or feel what you feel when you really help somebody. I don't know if they've ever had that feeling. And what the preacher is saying is that's what being connected to Christ gives you. That connection, that sense of belonging. Golly, I think that's really important stuff. All right. Continuing on, he then gets into a little section about worship and service, and the section is it's a little problem. It's kind of a naughty little problem of folks confusing grace and regulations. It's this whole business of talking about what foods you can eat that have been sacrificed to other gods and all this other kind of stuff. And I'm really not going to wade into the food related issue here, but that some people, it's easier to turn faith into something that's strictly rule-based, right? And missing the grace. If I can just turn it into a series of regulations, then I can control it, right? And I think churches are, throughout 2,000 years, congregations, denominations, there are certain people, they love rules. They love regulations. If you follow those, if you do X, Y, and Z, then A, B, and C will happen, and all great. That's perfect. And what the preacher is saying is that the moment you do that is the moment you've taken all of the grace out of this thing that is supposed to be born of grace, right? It's the people who say, well, kids can have free lunches if they qualify for them. No, just give every kid free lunch. Don't worry about it, right? And it's interesting because people are starting to realize that, you know what? That just makes kids feel weird if you keep separating them based on their income level. Why not just treat the kids the same in that sense? If you want lunch, you get lunch. If you want to bring lunch from home, you bring lunch from home. Right? We can get hung up on regulation. We can get hung up, and so they are going to be spending so much more time focused on about these few food purity issues and not just come to the table. Just come to worship. Just be a part of the community. If you do that, and so it's one of those things. This is starting to become lesser concern in the list of announcements that the preacher is making, but it's really kind of an important thing. And then the next thing is that the preacher is really starting to hit something that we've got a bad habit of turning inward when things are hard out there in the world, right? And Jesus has called us to engage with the world even though it's throwing everything but the kitchen sink at us. Like, yeah, times are hard. You know what? If times are hard for us, it means times are hard for everybody. And that means that the need is out there. And so we got to get out there and do it. Um, and it's one of those little things that the preacher just wants to make sure that everybody hears before they're heading out the door. Because now, the sermon's has wound down, the service is winding down, his announcements, and people are starting to get, they're shuffling, they're putting their coats on, in the last 3 minutes, they're not hearing anything. I always remembered that about when I was teaching. I taught 50-minute classes, and I swear, there was a sound that only students could hear at 47 minutes into the class because everybody would start packing up their backpacks, right? No, of course, none of this happened, but it just, or nothing actually did. But I would always tell the students, I was like, wait. I said, did you guys just hear a bell that is, can't be heard by professors? Because you're all packing your bags all at the same time. What if I say something really important these last 3 minutes? And they're like, are you going to say something important these last 3 minutes? I said, I guarantee you from now on, I'm always going to have at least one quiz question that comes from the last 3 minutes of my lecture. They stopped packing their bags so soon. I said, you're going to be able to get, your next class is literally next door. You're going to be fine. You have plenty of time to get there. But it was just one of those things. And so, but the preacher knows that people are starting to get a little antsy. And so every comment he's making is shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter right now. Because he's just trying to hit the greatest hits. These are the needs for the week or the time, right? And so it's just like, you got to go out there and engage the world. Don't, yeah, things are tough. Please get out there and do the work. And at the last, the preacher winds down by the time we get to verses 18 and 19, and he or she asks for a prayer from the congregation. They're still on the road. They're still out. There's a reason why this is a letter or why this is being sent to them, is that they're out doing the work and that they'll be back soon, right? That the preacher is going to be returning to this congregation and looking forward to the homecoming and getting back together again, but the work continues. And so please pray for me, right? Is what the preacher is saying. Because if it's hard for the congregation, it's hard for the preacher too, right? That that person is putting themselves out there all the time. And so they need to do that. And just to wrap things up then, we get to verses 20 to 21, which is a benediction. And what's really interesting is it reaches back to the whole sermon that was just preached. And the preacher is going to hit these important moments and these important notes one more time. And it's done in a benediction, which is just, the last prayer, right? The sending, just to be sure that folks have heard what needs to be heard. And so begins with the God of peace, who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is a bit of a paraphrase as we go through it. But notice, each sentence, each phrase is a theological statement and a recapitulation of the whole thing. The God of peace who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, because way back at the beginning of this class, what was the concern? The concern was that the people in this congregation were done. They were tired. They were ready to throw in the towel because they were so worried that they were essentially following a guy who died, right? That this was just, he's a nice man. It was all very good, but we worship a broken man on a cross, and it feels like there's got to be something more in order for us to continue to pour our energy into this, because if this is all there is, we're done, we're out. And so he reiterates, no, Jesus has been raised, right? And then he starts to talk about the great shepherd of the sheep, right? They are not without a leader. They are not without a guide. They are not without a shepherd who's going to say, and we're going this direction, everybody, right? I've always thought that the shepherd of the sheep is one way of saying it, but my other phrase is herding cats, right? Clergy have a tendency to herd cats, right? Because they don't all want to go in the same direction. They don't even want to listen. but you got to get them you move them in the direction. And the great shepherd of the sheep by the blood of the eternal covenant. And so this goes all the way back to that whole story about Jesus as in the vein of the high priest of Melchizedek. Make you complete in everything good so that you may do his will. And that's the whole business of sanctification, getting better at all of these things. Jesus became like us so that we could become more like him. That's the business of sanctification. And then working among us that which is pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory forever and ever. And the sermon ends where it began, with Christ in glory. The whole thing wraps up in this beautiful benediction that hits all of these same points. Yes, essentially, things are hard, but Jesus is more than just a broken man on a cross. He is Savior. He is Shepherd. He has redeemed you. He has done all these things, and the work continues. And so this letter is there to say, you're in the right place. You're doing the right thing. Focus a little bit. Be strengthened by what Christ does, and then off you go to continue to do the work. Really is a marvelous, marvelous letter. There's a lot to it. I encourage you to, dig through certain parts of it again. But I'm glad we've had the opportunity, because I really do think, and I'm going to finish with this, I think this is the letter that the church needs to listen to right now. Not just Genesis Lutheran Church, I mean not the whole thing, right? Is that it's really easy to say, you know what? We're done, right? The world is in a terrible place. Look at these yahoos that are running the show, who seem to just thrive on the cruelty that they inflict. Maybe this whole thing just doesn't work. Maybe Jesus is a relic of a dead past, right? And the preacher reminds us of the living God, of the great shepherd, of the one who has done all of this for us so that we can go out there and try to chip away at the bad in the world. Because the other part of sanctification is that not only are we trying to get better, we're trying to make the world better. And the world doesn't get better without us pushing. And so he says, I know it's hard, but you're not doing this in vain. Christ is with you. Keep pushing, because that's what we've been called to do, and it's going to work. It's going to move in the right direction if we continue to push it in the right direction. And we know which way to go because the shepherd has led us there. And that at the end of all of our struggles, at the end of this life, we know that we will rest in Christ's care in heaven, the New Jerusalem, that the feast that we have a foretaste of in communion, in the worship, right? Well, we're joined to all the saints in heaven. That's what's going on in this. And I find it to be vital and important and affirming in a time when it could be really easy to get really down, right, about things, because we look at the world. But the thing about Jesus and the thing about Christianity is that we were never intended to try to look for the exits. We're trying to figure out how to help people on the way. That's the call. Jesus didn't look for the exits, right? Jesus came to us, was incarnate, so that he could help us through it all. We don't give up when the things get tough. We just dig in and we make sure we're going in the right direction. I think that's really important. I really do. I think the church needs to hear that now more than ever. And so I appreciate you guys hanging with me today. And for those of you all of you who joined us online today, this is our last Bible study of the year. And the reason for that is very simple. We're getting into holiday season. And soon the church will be absolutely consumed with our Adopt a Family food basket outreach program. We're going to get into Advent soon. It becomes harder to do our weekly Bible study. But we will start once again in the new calendar year in January. I do not know what I'm going to do next. And so if anybody has requests, and that's for those of you who are online as well, I'm still open because I do have time. I have plenty of time to start doing some reading. And just to say it, I love doing these, right? This is the way I get to really dig deep into some of these. And so I'm wide open, right? Just did New Testament, so maybe we want to go back to the Old Testament again, but I'm absolutely open. But thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everybody who is joining us online today. And don't forget, even though we don't have Bible study now the rest of this calendar year, we do have worship 10 o'clock for Genesis. For those of you who may be joining from the other Pastor Grant's congregations, 9 o'clock St. Paul, 11 o'clock St. James. We just got you covered all morning on Sundays. So we'll see you in church. Thanks, everybody.